45 million people in the world could be pushed into acute hunger by June if the Middle East conflict persists and if oil prices remain above $100 a barrel. That's according to the UN Food Agency, which says about half of the people likely to be hit are in the continent. So, African and Asian countries are particularly at risk because they heavily rely on food and fuel imports. Oil and gas prices have risen in many African countries in less than 3 weeks as the war on Iran continues. Columbus Mavunga reports from Zimbabwe's capital, Harare, where the government has just announced another price hike.
Zimbabwe imports almost all of its fuel, and with the global energy supply chain disrupted in the Middle East, petrol and diesel prices have risen sharply to more than $2 a litre.
Customers are wailing. We were charging them with $1 one way. It's now $2 because diesel is now $2.19 a litre. Yet there are no salary increments. So this is now affecting our business as some customers are now resorting to walking on foot.
Diesel prices are slightly lower than petrol to protect what Harare calls the productive sectors like mining, agriculture and manufacturing. The government says Zimbabwe has enough stocks of petroleum products for more than 3 months. It says its intervention is meant to cushion consumers from sharp price increases, particularly for diesel, which is critical to key sectors of the economy. It says without this intervention, the price of diesel would have been at least $2.20 per litre in Zimbabwe. But some say it's not enough.
The increase is sudden and it's hard to cope because we're used to lower prices. Like now 20 litres is now costing $40. It's really bad. I do not think there is really anything the government can do.
Other Zimbabweans are worried that the cost of living will inevitably go up as farming and transport costs for staples like bread, corn flour, and cooking oil increase.
The rate at which fuel price is increasing is bad. I wish the warring parties can talk peace because worldwide everyone is crying because when fuel prices increase, everything goes up. Food and everything needs transportation, so everything goes up, even in supermarkets, yet salaries remain stagnant.
Despite the 58% fuel increase this month alone, the Zimbabwe government says it will keep the hikes to a minimum. But it may struggle to keep that promise if the war continues to disrupt fuel and food imports into this landlocked country. Columbus Mavunga, Africa Matters, Harare.
And rising oil, gas, shipping, insurance and freight costs, the World Food Programme warns, will likely trigger record hunger levels. Today, over 300 million people globally can only put food on the table by selling off their assets. The UN Food Agency predicts that over 17 million more people in East and Southern Africa will struggle to have enough food. With over 10 million more in West and Central Africa, that makes up more than half of the 45 million people that could go hungry by June. About 5.2 million people in the Middle East and North Africa also face food insecurity.
The oil shocks will also transmit quickly into food price inflation, particularly in import-dependent economies, as energy is a critical input to agriculture systems. So taken together, the spike in global food and fuel costs could leave millions of families priced out of stable foods, particularly in import-dependent countries like Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia.
But the war is also affecting African exports to the Middle East. Fruit growers in South Africa say 90% of their exports to the region have been affected by delays and shipping routes disruptions. While in Kenya, fresh meat exports have drastically reduced during the peak Ramadan season as traders struggle to move a fraction of their usual volumes, as Brenda Zederardido reports.
The Ramadan season is usually lucrative for Kenyan meat exporters to the Middle East. But since the war on Iran began, business has faltered. Production lines in this slaughterhouse located in central Kenya have slowed down. Cold storage rooms are quickly filling up.
Things just happened in fraction of seconds or in fraction of minutes that this has been stopped and all that. So I cannot compare this time or whatever has happened in the last 1.5 week with anything else apart from the COVID.
Kenya meat exporters rely on flights to deliver meat to the Gulf countries, but flight and airspace disruptions have driven up war risk insurance costs and cut cargo capacity. Exporters now have no option but to turn to expensive charters.
We are worried due to the customer purchasing power, especially during this time. It's during Ramadan. After Ramadan, if this war continues, we won't be in business because now the purchasing power will have lowered. Yeah, right now maybe it's because of the demand and during their Ramadan period, that's when they uptake a lot of meat. But after Ramadan, on normal days after Ramadan, our business goes down.
The Middle East is Kenya's main export market for meat, with the United Arab Emirates accounting for nearly half of all shipments.
We are doing less than 5% of what we are supposed to be doing. We are only exporting to UAE. We normally export to Iran, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. Jordan is a new entrant, and also Saudi is a huge market for us. Currently, we are only exporting to Abu Dhabi Airport and Dubai Airport. We normally use Sharjah, but now we are not able to utilize it.
As the Iran war grinds on, rising costs continue to hit everyone on the supply chain, including livestock farmers. Brenda Zeda Radido, Africa Matters.
All right, let's hear more from David Laborde. He's Director of Agri-Food Economics Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and he joins me from Paris. Thank you so much, David, for making the time. I mean, straight on, just why are African countries particularly at risk of rising hunger levels because of the war on Iran? I mean, according to your analysis.
And you have basically two effects at play here. On one hand, in order to produce food, you need fertilizer. And even if in Africa, people use less fertilizer than in Asia or in Europe or in Latin America, actually, if Africa has less fertilizer, it will produce less food. And so it's going to increase the food insecurity in some of these countries, not immediately, but in the coming months. And then you just have an increase in the prices of everything, of energy, of food, and of course of fertilizer. And this is going to make people poorer because, the fact that you have food, if you cannot afford it, that's a problem. So you have these two effects. People that will have to spend more money on other things. And at the same time, we may see less food available at higher prices.
And that's the point, because like you're saying, early signals in international markets indicate that prices of major food commodities like wheat, rice, vegetable oils, fertilizers, like you mentioned, David, have started to increase. So the question then would be, what should governments, African governments, do, and urgently so?
So on one hand, they should really make sure that especially the most vulnerable people in their country are protected. So in terms of having social policy that will support them, like cash transfer. Then they need to make sure also that their farmers can access fertilizer and can access the finance to pay for fertilizer, but also that, trucks that will carry the fertilizer have diesel. So really consider, the fertilizer as a very strategic and important element, because if you don't have fertilizer, you don't produce food. So just focusing on food is what you do in the short term, but you need to make sure that you protect that. And after, I think also that, you have a number of African countries that export oil. And actually, they are going to make much more money. So the question for the continent will be also to see what type of solidarity can be put in place in order that the countries that are actually gaining from the current very high oil prices can support not only their population, but other countries that in Africa may not have oil to sell and just buy oil, fertilizer, and food.
But then, this has generally been a recurrent problem. I'm saying this quoting a report from your organization, actually, Food and Agriculture Organization for the UN, which said that in 2024, hunger affected about 307 million people in the continent. Last year, the same organization, your organization, SAR, did say that hunger levels on the African continent are rising while dropping elsewhere. So the question again is why is this happening? What are the gaps?
So even before this crisis, this year, that's a tipping point where basically half of the people in chronic hunger in the world are in Africa. And unfortunately, we will still have high level of hunger continuing in the coming years because Africa is having to deal with 4 challenges. On one hand, there is a growing population, so it means that we need more food. Then it's still a lack of economic growth, so people are poor, or in some cases, there is high level of inequality, so people cannot afford the food. Third, there is a recurrent lack of productivity in Africa. So even if Africa has land, has water, has people, it lacks also technology or access to inputs, including fertilizer. So it doesn't produce as much as food as it can, and at a cost that is relatively low. And fourth, unfortunately, Africa also is one of the continents most impacted by climate change. And so for many farmers, that you already face complicated economic condition, but at the same time, the weather gets worse and worse, and sometimes you have to deal with flood, with drought. And so you have a growing demand, you still lack money, and at the same time, your supply is constrained.
Right, and David, you talked about countries that are exporting oil on the African continent and just how they can reap from all of this, or basically maximize this conflict or the result of this conflict. But then the other question would be whether there are African countries, any African countries that are actually reducing hunger levels and boosting their food security. We've seen immediate interventions from certain countries, Tanzania, Kenya, South Africa, as a result of the impact of this war. But are there countries that are actually getting this right?
So, number of African countries have been through many crises, unfortunately, in the last few years. So some of them have already started to learn to react, to make also information system. I think it's very important, having the data, having the information in the hand of policymaker is key and still challenging. And of course, our organization help on that. But there's a number of initiatives in Africa doing this. So what we see, from West Africa, from Senegal to Kenya and Tanzania, as you were referring to, but also South Africa, people start to react. Now there is a very important balance between reacting and taking decision too early. So for instance, some countries say, okay, we need to buy fertilizer now because we may not have enough in a few months. But the price of fertilizer today are very, very high. So they have increased by 50%. So is it the right time to buy? So each country has to take decision, but having the right information is needed. And of course, all the country doesn't have the same fiscal capacity to tackle with this, because we also have a number of African countries that face high level of debt. So even if they could do the right things, they may not have the money to do the right things. And that's an additional burden on which, global solidarity should be mobilized to deal with.
Indeed. And we're talking about countries that are still recovering from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're still recovering from the war in Ukraine. And now we have the war on Iran. Just how can the continent buffer itself from such external shocks? And is it actually happening? Am I correct in saying that?
Yes. Now, unfortunately, also, we still have on the continent some countries that face domestic shock. You can think about Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, what is happening in the Sahel regions. So you have, and for many vulnerable population, you don't have security at home, you cannot take care of your field. It's more and more costly to deal with that. So that's some of the challenge that are faced. But at the same time, Africa is also progressing, Even if we have still a high level of hunger and sometimes an acceptable level of hunger, we have not seen in Africa the type of famine that we have seen in the 80s. So I really think that, we should acknowledge that there was progress is made, that a number of countries are trying new solutions, that we have also, better technology, and the use of cell phone has also helped people to get information quicker, so to anticipate a bit of this shock. We also have more continental initiative in agriculture with the CAADP policy that will give a framework for Africa. We start to get also more trade integration with African Free Trade Continental Area. So there is a things moving, but there is still, a lot of external pressure in some part of Africa, domestic challenges, and that's why the hunger situation is still very important to address. And at the end, we have this nexus between, energy, food security, and national security and political stability. And when one of them start to get destabilized, the others start to be impacted. And that's why, food security at the end is also a question of national security, and that's why it should be prioritized by the different countries.
Indeed, Mr. David Laborde, the Director of Agri-Food Economics Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Thank you very much for your time and your contribution, sir. Well, some African countries like Rwanda are working to reduce hunger early, particularly child stunting in under 5-year-olds. But in some communities, poverty forces families to make difficult choices to either sell food for income or keep it to feed their children. Diana Iriza traveled to Gishumbi in the country's northern province and brings us this report.
Felicite Mukeshimana arrives at this local early childhood development center to pick up her child. Not long ago, she was worried about her child's slow growth. Through training supported by the Rwanda Organization for Development Initiatives, she learned how nutrition can shape a child's development.
I didn't know before how important food and care are for a child. Now I prepare better meals and I see my child growing stronger.
In many rural homes, food is also a source of income, with little left for children.
I would rather sell the food and earn money to take my children to school. Whatever will feed them, they will still grow.
Health experts warn that undernutrition, repeated infection, and lack of social interactions and play for children under the age of 2 can lead to stunting, which is below average height, but can also affect brain development, learning ability, school and work performance later in life. Here in Gicumbi district, health workers measure children regularly to track their growth. The need is urgent. A national survey shows that about 33% of children under the age of 5 years in Rwanda are still stunted. The government says that it reduced stunting in children under the age of 5 years by 6 percentage points last year. This is done by increasing prenatal care, nutrition programs, and introducing regular screening to detect child malnutrition early. But experts say food alone is not the problem.
Children should be grow in terms of emotion, social emotional development, physical development, and cognitive, because the brain of children should be developed. So we need a holistic approach to support children. When it is not holistic, sometimes it can create a gap. The big issue is the mindset.
For Felicite, that shift has already begun. She says feeding her child well is no longer just a daily task, it is an investment in her child's future. Diana Iriza, Africa Matters, Gicumbi, Rwanda.
To Ivory Coast now, where farming has long been the backbone of the economy. But listen, UN data shows women in the country make up nearly half the working force in the sector, but only 5% of them own agricultural land. That's according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. But one association is working to change that, as Christina Shimich reports.
Rubber is crucial in the car industry, healthcare, and is a key component in manufactured goods, from fridge seals to mountings. Ivory Coast is Africa's largest rubber producer and the 6th globally, according to the Association of Natural Rubber Producing Countries. But there's a problem. Those who farm it, like 64-year-old Afua Mia, often get little to no returns.
It's our inheritance for all of us, but when we are done, I worked with my brothers and I saw that what they gave me are just crumbs. That's why I decided to set up my own plantation.
It's all down to land ownership.
There are other places where girls are not allowed to inherit land, and when that's the case in those places, it's difficult. We have to look at how we can solve this problem, because we can't just leave these women like that. So now we have to move on to another phase of negotiation. Either we negotiate with the landowners, the village chiefs, the traditional leaders, or we negotiate with their husbands so that they give a small portion or a portion to their wives.
To close the gender gap, the Association of Natural Rubber Professionals of Ivory Coast offers women subsidies to buy rubber trees, sometimes as much as 80%. And just last year, Afua was able to purchase her own piece of land using her own savings from the subsidies she received.
I'm really independent and free because I know that what I'm doing is for myself. And it's me who has done it for myself. So really, I am free and I am happy.
Since 2009, around 2,500 women have bought subsidised rubber plants.
Thanks to my plantation, at the end of every month, I earned $122. I'm like a civil servant. I take the money, so my life has changed thanks to my plantation.
The association says demand has increased over the last 5 years.
As you know, the Ivory Coast is an agricultural country producing coffee, cocoa, and rubber. So coffee and cocoa were the first choices, but more and more women are becoming interested in rubber cultivation. It is this observation that has led us to include women in our development program at all levels.
Helping more women put their rubber stamp on land ownership documents. Christina Shimich, Africa Matters.
Well, African football has been rocked by the announcement that Senegal has been stripped of the African Cup of Nations title and Morocco declared champions. It's been 2 months since the Teranga Lions lifted and celebrated with the trophy, but now continental football authorities have overturned the result. Peter Franks has the story.
Thousands of Senegalese fans celebrated with their team in Dakar as they paraded the Africa Cup of Nations trophy. The Teranga Lions had beaten Morocco 1-0 in Rabat to win the AFCON title for just the second time in their history. But 2 months later, the dream has turned into a nightmare, with African football officials overturning the result and awarding the match to Morocco.
Honestly, it was news that was both shock and joy at the same time. But we focus on the good news rather than what hurt us after the complaints on the day of the final. Thankfully, CAF was fair to us. And I hope the trophy will be given to us after the Senegalese team tried to appeal to CAS.
The final had been one of the most controversial in AFCON history, with Senegal feeling they were on the wrong side of referee decisions all game. And head coach Pape Thiaw snapped after the team had a goal disallowed and the hosts awarded a penalty in stoppage time. Thiaw pulled his players from the field in protest and confusion reigned for 17 minutes before Senegal returned to continue. In a massive twist, Brahim Diaz had his penalty saved before Senegal's Pape Gueye scored an extra-time winner. Senegalese celebrations continued long and hard, but in the background Morocco had appealed to CAF in protest at the outcome. And after 57 days deliberation, officials awarded Morocco a 3-0 win after invoking a rule that states players must not leave the field without permission of the referee.
I'm stunned. Football no longer exists. This is not football. No one here understands or accepts this decision by CAF. We're shocked. Corruption has ended up winning.
The decision has stunned the football fraternity, and Senegal have already said they will appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. That uncertain process will take time and energy when both teams should be focusing on the upcoming World Cup that starts in June. Going into the biggest tournament in football as AFCON winner is great for confidence, but by that time it's unlikely anyone will know who the real champion is. Peter Franks, Africa Matters.
That's our show this week. Let us know how the price hikes because of the Iran war are affecting you by leaving your comments and suggestions on our Africa Matters YouTube page or on X. Thanks for watching, and it's goodbye from me, Grace Korea Kanja.